Hey everyone. This week we close out with our final thoughts on The Feather Thief, as well as talk about the importance of museums and their collections. It's our last episode before we talk to the author, Kirk Wallace Johnson, so get ready for that next week. We recorded it last weekend and I've been listening to it, and a lot of it is going to blow your mind. He's so great. This week we talk a little bit about obsession in general and how it is human nature to become obsessed. Whether it was Alfred Russel Wallace or even Edwin Rist, it's important to channel that obsession into something positive because it can go dark really quick. We start off talking about the accomplice in the book named Long and whether or not he was manipulated by Edwin. I know some of this is dark. We'll be back to our regularly scheduled programming discussing birds soon enough. Once back, we're kicking it off with episodes on the Harlequin Duck and the Mourning Dove, so get ready for those in a couple weeks. Okay, but for now, go grab your binoculars and let's get into it. Where do you guys all land on this Long? Was he manipulated by Edwin, did you all think? I feel like it's a little open-ended as far as Long's involvement in all of this. It seemed like he was posting stuff on behalf of Edwin, but then when Kirk actually met him, he kind of felt sorry for Long a little bit, like he had been taken advantage of by Edwin. But I still feel like Long committed crimes as well. It's like a lot of, it's like
Dumb
it's hard
and Dumber, right? That's what it reminded me of.
True.
But, when you don't understand the value of something, you can think it's not that big of a deal. And anybody can get sucked into cults, right? And that's what this kind of feels like, a cult of fly tying. And you get so insular in your ideas about what you think that you either lose sight of what's right or wrong, or you just don't think outside of that little tiny, and that's a tiny sphere, right? When you talk about that community, it's a very small world that they're living in.
Tiny sphere with a willing to spend a lot of money on those things.
Right. A lot of people are willing to spend a lot of money on their tiny little spheres. So really interesting.
I think, Rist was a bad actor, and you can't totally insure or insulate against bad actors, but how he was punished, that's something we can have influence on. We obviously don't think that was appropriate. How the court system handled that. And he had, a great defense. And I also, I think there's a lot of problems with how he was defended, how they reasoned why he did what he did. But I feel like there's not a lot of point in demonizing him. It's like how we handled what he did and how we don't think that was good. I think obviously none of us think he was adjudicated appropriately.
Right. And this is where I can get myself in big trouble. If this had happened in the U.S., I think he would be in jail right now.
I think so. I hope so. Yeah, I think so too, John. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But only if this community, only if we made sure that people in the legal system were educated about the value of these specimens, right?
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't be if we just quietly let it go without saying we didn't want to talk about that and we didn't want to draw attention to it because it made us look bad. So, yeah.
Actually, we know of an example where a university refused to go after a graduate student in the U.S. who was selling specimens online because they got access to things that were sitting in a hallway and not being used.
Why did they refuse to act against that student?
So I think it's
they don't want to take the time, they don't want to take the resource, and the university doesn't want to be embarrassed.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
It comes back to what Kirk very much feels that the reaction he got from the British Museum in general with respect to the whole situation. And that's really unfortunate.
Shame is a powerful motivator to hide. So to own your shame, which is the only way to really get past it, is that you have to feel that. Then you have to feel it, which doesn't feel good, which is why most people don't want to feel it. Most institutions don't want to take the hit of that. But then you lose the learning opportunity. And this is one of the things why this book is so valuable, because it puts that learning opportunity into the hands of other museums to say, okay, this happened, it's horrible. What are we going to do in our museum that this doesn't happen to us? What kinds of policies and procedures do we need to put in place to protect the specimens?
And the British Museum is unfortunately, in my opinion, curious example of all this. So I think I may have mentioned this earlier, there's discussion of actually moving the collection in Tring out of Tring, which is, again, this tiny little village and the collection is on the Rothschild estate, which was just a big plot of land with buildings on it when it started, back into the collections associated with the British Museum. But the irony there is that while the British Museum has always stored their specimens in London, that's becoming more and more problematic given the size of the collections and interest in doing things associated with more exhibit space. And this has been going on. Charles Darwin was complaining about the British Museum getting rid of their herbarium back in the 1880s because they wanted more exhibit space. And so things like this have gone on for a long time within museums. Anyways, they basically made agreements with the University of Reading, which is outside of London, to build a large collection facility. And this gets into another hugely problematic thing, I think, down the road with respect to collections, is if all the British Museum collections, and again, this is birds, mammals, invertebrates, insects, go out to this place in Reading, they'll still be accessible to the scientific community. But coming back to what Shannon was describing earlier, they won't be all that accessible to the public. The public won't remember where they are. And so down the road, as they look for money, the next administrative team looking for money to support the collections out at Reading, no longer in downtown London, have they just lost some really significant leverage with respect to the value of these collections? So I think, anyways, I always think that collections, as Shannon's been saying, are things that we're always having to argue for and argue about the value of. And I think there's real value to having them in places where people can come and see them. And Tring is demonstrably not an example where they're particularly easy to see. Not that people don't go. There's a public museum at Tring, which is really nice and interesting, but it takes a real effort to get there.
And if you want to protect specimens from being stolen, that's a human endeavor. That takes the whole of a museum. Every security agent who walks through the museum in the middle of the night, every person who walks up and down the halls. And if you put them in a place where there aren't people, and you're not going to staff a facility that fully away from the main parts of the museum, they're vulnerable. The time to find something would be much longer because, people are expensive. And this is going to sound rude. Even most museum administrators don't understand why we have so many. And that tension between supporting the actual collections and exhibitions that you can put your name on, this is difficult priorities that we see play out every day in every museum with every friend of ours we know who's a part of any museum. This is a dynamic tension that is very difficult to navigate through. Museums need more people. They just frankly do. And they may need them in the public exhibit areas too, and the exhibition staff may need more people. Fine, that's probably true too. But behind the scenes, we need more staff to adequately prepare, conserve,
database,
image, get genome sequences, whatever it is. We need more people. People are expensive. And museums are notorious for being cheap in how much they pay people and exploiting the fact that they love what they do and they love their institution. And every museum I know of is exploitive in this way. And I don't like it. I don't like it. We haven't paid interns in the past. And that was something when I started, when the DNA Discovery Center in the museum opened. I insisted that we pay the interns, summer interns that we were going to have. Because if you don't, all you get are rich people's kids in your museum, people who don't have to work in the summertime. Most teenagers need to work in the summertime so that they make money for themselves and their families, just the way it is. And if you can't pay them and pay them a decent wage, you can't educate a bunch of different kinds of people. The only way museums survive is if a lot of people, different kinds of people, understand and appreciate their value. And you don't do that just by educating rich white people. You don't. And so we have to place the value and priorities where they belong. And that doesn't make administrators famous. It doesn't make them at parties with rich people. It doesn't, all the things that take away, you kind of need to do, but that can take away. And so, there's always this fight against human nature to support things that aren't pretty, that aren't fancy, to support people with idiosyncratic and unique bits of expertise. And it's really easy to think of people as interchangeable parts of a puzzle, right? The same size and shape of a piece as everyone else. So if this one wants more money, well, we'll just replace it with a different one. Not understanding that that person has unique expertise and has a unique commitment to the institution and deserves to be paid a living wage to work there. Not to be exploited because they love people, they love the institution, and they love its mission.
I do think that there's, we were talking about the birds that were stolen and how colorful they were. And I think that that's a factor in getting people's attention on this too, which I always find interesting. And had they just been little brown birds that were somehow valuable, we probably wouldn't be hearing about this.
Hearing both of you talk about this just makes me really love what the four of us are doing here too, because you're talking about how important learning about these collections are for the general public and everything like that. And it's I was just thinking in my head, well, what's a way that you guys could promote that more so people know about it? And then it's we're kind of doing that a little bit or a lot of it at this point, based on what we've been talking about these last, 4 or 5 episodes.
Yeah.
So
I think Kirk's book really does a good job of that. When he talks to Rick Prum, we know Rick Prum, and he 100% captures Rick Prum in his descriptions of him. And Rick is pretty much like most of us in the museum world. All of our friends are a lot like that. Everybody has their own idiosyncrasies, of course, but that degree of commitment and passion and the kind of doggedness to hunt that down, the idea that it's on a thumb drive, it's not like Watergate, but with the whole world at stake when you do these things. But it's the same kind, we feel the same way about these things as Woodward and Bernstein felt about that. These are, every scientist has this hunter, and you have to know to the ends of the earth, have to know what's happening and how it works, and then has to protect in that sense. It's like if there's a mystery and you just are going to go until you can't find any more about the mystery. And then you find someone else who can find more things, right? So Rick Prum, and this is actually something I really admire too, is that he was going to give everything he knew to Kirk because that could take it further than he could take it himself, right? So that's a kind of, and publications are like that. It's a generosity of spirit. It's part of the process anyways. You have to tell people things. When you know things, you have to tell people. It's an obligation that scientists have. But we tell a lot of people things that we don't put in publications because we hope that person can figure it out. We don't want to keep just the knowledge for ourselves, because there's no end to the number of projects we can think of in our minds. There's no end to the number of projects our specimens could can inspire.
And I feel like that's like a running thread through the book, with like starting with Wallace with his, desire to do everything that he was doing. And then when his collection was caught on fire at sea and lost it, and he could, it's like, he doubled down and was like, I'm going to go research even more and contribute even more. And then I feel like you look at Kirk, he has that same mindset where it's like, I'm just going to explore every detail until, leave no stone unturned and just figure everything out. I don't know. It's fun seeing people that are like that. And it's just like what you're talking about, Shannon. It's like, I don't know, really inspiring to see people that do care that much and are just like, no, we need to figure everything out and categorize everything and figure out what is what and where it belongs.
But that's what having a child has kind of really taught me, or made me pay more attention to. And that is the part of the human experience. Little kids, babies, are driven to learn, like unbelievably driven to learn, to the extent that you really have to put them in a deprivation position to stop that. It's just fundamentally part of what they are and what they do. And you see that every day when you have a kid, because one day they can't do something and the next day they can. And I used to think of that when I would watch Pete, like, oh my God, overnight your brain grew and you couldn't sit up yesterday, but you can today. What on earth happened to you while you were sleeping? I felt like that about his sense of humor too. He had no sense of humor until he was 11 years old. He didn't find jokes funny. He thought they were mean. And all of a sudden at 11 years old, he started telling jokes and they were incredibly dry. And that's still his humor, right? And so something happened to him while he was sleeping, that all of a sudden he could, in his mind, some like 3D thinking happened, and he could appreciate the context of a joke and what they could do other than just thinking of them as being mean. And that's kind of what being a parent was like for me, was a long-term behavioral experiment, the way I would want to watch a bird if I watched him that way. And I know that makes people think I'm really weird, and I've been told that in the past, but that's kind of what it was. And that thing that made Rick Prum want to know and start keeping information is the same thing that makes a baby crawl and be obsessively active when it comes to that. Our son was obsessed with sports. Like, it was the only thing you could do with him is squash it. And he would have resisted every attempt to squash his obsession with sports. And he did resist.
So the danger there is that Edwin Rist clearly got the bug from his parents about how interesting fish fly tying is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's, the human nature is is variable too. What makes people great can make them horrible.
Imagine if he had used that effort for something good instead of something bad, what he could have contributed, rather than being this, I don't know, horrible villain that he was. If he had contributed something, I mean, I don't know. It's crazy to think about.
That's the duality that is, or the spectrum that's inside of every person. The same things that make people great make them evil.
Yeah.
You never read this book before you got interested in birds. What did reading this book, how did it affect you, or what do you think differently about either museums or specimens or people? What do you take away?
Yeah, so I think just like really understanding like museum specimens' importance to science and their contribution to science was like a huge takeaway from this. And just even understanding that museum specimens exist in general. Before I had met both of you and before I read this book, I didn't really understand that they were, how both important they were and just how large they were. And so, I don't know, reading this book definitely like opened my eyes to that, I felt like. And I feel like both from like a historical perspective and from a scientific perspective, like I loved how he started out with Wallace, like, telling that whole story. And so because I think, John, when we first met you, we saw, some specimen that had tags on it that Wallace had found. And this was not long after reading The Feather Thief and just being like, wow, he went through I mean, he went through hell to collect all these things with this passion that he was going to contribute to science, and just knowing what he went through was enough to be blown away at seeing like a Wallace specimen. And then reading further on into the book and talking to both of you, learning more about like kind of the scientific importance of everything, just added like a whole other layer.
So I think that specimen that I showed you is a greater bird of paradise, and the actual tag on that bird says old specimen collected by Wallace, Aru Islands. So I always like to point out to people that we don't know for sure that Wallace actually collected that bird. Somebody else wrote that on the tag at some point, and it's from the Rothschild Museum, so it actually came from the Rothschild collection. The reason we think it, and I think the reason somebody wrote that on the tag is in 1853, Wallace published a paper because he was in the Aru Islands on the behavior and displays of greater birds of paradise. And so it's perfectly logical that he would have collected a specimen or two, and that those would have, and maybe he didn't label it very well or something. But, again, it just, it highlights all this aspects of what you're talking about.
Oh, yeah.
Amanda, what about you?
So I had read it for my book club before I got into birding and stuff. And yeah, I think what I took away from the book and what you two have reinforced even more strongly is just the value of these specimens. Like, even if they are locked away, they're not on display, the infinite value that they can have now and into the future. And just, you two always talk about how technology is advancing in a way that we may be able to use these specimens in ways we can't even imagine now. So I think that's really interesting. Like, the value is inestimable because it may be in the future something even greater than what we can do now. And I always think about when Shannon's talked about color before, and how people in the past, I don't know if the past few decades, have used like UV lighting to understand what different birds' feathers are like. And I think that's so interesting. That's something that they couldn't have imagined 100 years ago, being able to do. So I just think, yeah, that's what I've gleaned from the book and then from our talking about it. And I loved the book. The book was so, just my book club loved the book. And I wanted to read one of our, we got a listener letter from Diane, who's one of our biggest fans. She read the book and she said, I like the end of our second podcast about the feather thief, when John points out that the fly tyers didn't think that the birds were being used for anything, just collected. Most people, including me, don't appreciate how the birds continually give information to be used in new ways. And then she had an interesting observation. She said, a weird thought came to mind. The Leopold and Loeb murder was an illustration of an extremely bright and pampered young men who thought they were beyond punishment for a crime, just like Edwin. Yeah, and it's true. He feared being caught, but I also think he looked at it all as like a challenge. I don't know, but I thought that was a cool note. Yeah.
We can talk about that at some point and bring on some folks that know a lot more about the whole Leopold and Loeb thing. Leopold was a budding ornithologist, and he at least actually
a good one too.
He actually, he squandered a major career in it. So it's, I'm coming back to what Shannon was saying with human nature, is it can take people in very strange directions, for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
One of the things we haven't talked about is just how many person hours went into preparing those specimens, not just to get them, which is considerable, and the expense of that, especially way back then, was unbelievably expensive, which is why only rich people could do it. But, it takes, when you're really good at that, at preparing a specimen, takes maybe an hour longer for one of these fancy burrs where you really have to arrange the feathers when you're putting them into a position to dry them. So think about how many hours were stolen. Mm-hmm. How many hours went into preparing those specimens? It takes you 10 minutes to tear them apart. Maybe not even that much to cut them apart. It takes you several minutes to write out a tag because the data on that tag are so important that you don't make mistakes when you write out a tag, not purposefully anyways. So the tags are not just things to be cut off of a bird and discarded. It's important primary data that we take a lot of care about. The tags cost money too. They're expensive. They're made out of special paper. We use special pens to write on them so that that water and other things don't leach off the information. That's how important it is. It's not just, a ballpoint pen anymore. So it takes a lot of time and effort to do that. You think about how much money was put into the British Museum to care for those things, to buy cases. Cases are not cheap. Neither is the material we put inside the cases to prevent insects from having a party in there. So there's a lot of accessory pieces that you only see if you're inside the museum, just the true cost associated with caring for a specimen. So we don't take caring for them lightly.
Do you think a good punishment for Rist would be that he has to go start collecting specimens in New Guinea and live in the jungle by himself like Wallace did and get attacked by bugs? And
yeah.
I know what he collects will never be as impactful as what he had been lost. But
so
put that guy to work.
The funny thing there is it could be.
Oh,
yeah. It could be.
Yeah, I don't know. The appropriate punishment has to do with changing someone's mind and having them then advocate for the things that they devalued and debased so dramatically. And putting him in prison isn't going to do that, even though that the part of the retribution part I feel is that, I don't want you to ever see the light of day again. What you did was so horrific. Okay, fine. But the only way it works is if then that person goes out and is an evangelist for why we keep museums, why specimens are so important to house in a museum and to make available for scientific study. So how do you get someone to do that? I mean, part of what he did is an honoring of that, right? They're so valuable that he got a glass cutter, broke into the museum and took them. I mean, okay,
right.
They have a lot of value, right? So how do you turn that for good? I think the only way you can turn you can't control every person, but the only way you can turn that into good is if society does a better job of understanding all of its pieces so that people don't go down that pathway so much to think that the specimens are never used. You still don't get that mentality inside of that fly tie community that, that we don't deserve to have them behind the scenes because we don't use them. But the thing is that you're stealing from yourself because this is common good.
The concept of public service is an interesting aspect of punishment that would have been interesting here.
All right. Well, I think are we ready to wrap it up on this one? This is our last meeting before we talk to Kirk. We're excited to have Kirk on to close this all out. Any closing thoughts on the book before we talk to Kirk next week?
I think you guys clearly enjoyed the book and learned a lot from it. And anybody who reads it, I think, will too. And hearing from Kirk about the way he thinks about it, I think is going to be a lot of fun.
I'm curious to know how that experience of doing all that research and writing that book, how that changed him. So what does he take from that to what he's going to do next or what he is doing now? So I won't say this while he's on because it's embarrassing, but I also think his kids are really lucky to have someone with that much kind of integrity.
Yeah.
And a strong moral, ethical compass. His kids are lucky.
Yeah, that's one of the big takeaways from the book is Kirk is like, I mean, he's like a superhero kind of. It's so cool to see someone who cares so passionately about so many different things.
Right.
From his background and what he was doing before he started the book to going into the book. It's like he's somebody that I don't know. I'm just really excited for us to chat with him.
For sure.
Really admirable.
He gave a talk at the Society for the Preservation of Natural History Collections meetings in Chicago, probably 5 or 6 years after the book came out. You know, it's a message that the museum community needs to hear over and over again, not just the public.
You know, academia is a weird thing. We don't get positively evaluated based on our ability to tell stories to the public. It's just not a thing. It won't make you have better raises. Academia is just harsh when it comes to that. And so you're not incentivized or given any training in how to tell stories to the public, how to take the things that you learn and make them accessible to other people. And I personally think that's a really important part of what we should be doing. We can't make people care about it if we can't tell people why it's important. You can't sit behind your desk and think that people are too dumb to understand what it is that you do. That's your responsibility to tell people why you're doing what you're doing, to get people excited about it. Because things matter. Weird things matter. Rosie Periwinkle from Madagascar had a cure for childhood leukemia. Well, that can't happen if there aren't a bunch of different people who are involved in both collecting, documenting biodiversity, and understanding that it can be used for more than that, and it should be, and interacting with people who can take it to a different place. If we don't document biodiversity in this way, we can't understand what happens when you pull out a piece of it, when you collapse ecosystems, because everything's networked. It's not hierarchical, it's networked. And pulling on one piece, pulling it out, can collapse a whole network. And you don't know which piece or how many pieces or which connection you can break, which ones you can't. And the museums are the only place you can understand the past. And so that's why it's so important that we keep putting specimens into our museum so we can understand what happens in a changing world, that we can go back and figure out what things were like before so that we can understand what might happen as we do other things. From the actual specimens, actual material. You're not going to learn about ivory-billed woodpecker from a picture book, but you can come in our museum.
You can start from learning from that.
You can. But you're not going to learn how to protect the next rare hummingbird from extinction just through pictures. You have to be able to integrate all these varying things together with new people and new tools and new knowledge. And the only place you can do that is in museums. They're not dusty places where nothing happens. They're not places where we don't understand why we have so many. And they're not places where those fly tie people aren't benefiting from medicinal things and from biological and environmental knowledge that saves their lives and the lives of their families. Individuals, not just conceptually. That's why we have so many, and that's why we keep, despite all the difficulties, and it's not easy to get permission to do this, or to have the skills to do this, or to get funding to train people so that we can have people doing this into the future. This all takes time, commitment, money, effort, and lots of different kinds of people. But people in museums are committed to these things. You don't see it because it's not anything that gets you put on Entertainment Tonight on TV or anything like that. But I mean, there's a lot of committed people in museums, whether that's the housekeeping staff in museums or the security staff, the people who raise funds. All of the people who do this are important.
Thanks everyone for listening. Next week, we interview the author Kirk Wallace Johnson, so get ready for that because it's going to be wild. You won't believe what Kirk shares with us, so buckle up. Reminder, if you have a question for us, you can reach us at podcast.birdsofafeather@gmail.com. If you're enjoying this, please leave a review and share this with someone who you think would enjoy it. It really would help us. All right, we love you all. See you all next week. Thanks for listening.